So this session, we'll take just a second before we start. This session, we're gonna talk about co-teaching, and I'll go around and let you all tell me, what grade you teach, and do you have a co-teacher in your classroom, and what your content area is. I'll close this door so we can hear. Come on in. Find your seat wherever you'd like. We're just getting started, so we've got getting signed in. So if you'll just let me know your name and your grade level, and do you in your co-teaching situation, if you're regular ed and have a co-teacher, or if you're special ed and you're in the co-teaching setting. So y'all want to start right here?
Yeah, I'm Chris Walker. I teach math at Jenkins Middle School. I do 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I don't know if it will be considered a co-teacher, but I will have a math tutor in the classroom with me, supposed to be collaborating with the division.
Okay, good.
I'm Tiffany Walker. I'm a high school business teacher.
Business, do you have anybody in there that have collaborated with you?
I'm Jacqueline Kidd. I'm teaching Spanish this year at Jenkins Independent Schools. I'm teaching all grade levels.
My name's Logan Gibbs. I teach 4th and 5th grade math and science, and I'm kind of the same as Chris. I've got a gear up tutor who comes into my room for my math classes.
Okay.
My name's Ricky Shepherd. I have been, this is my 25th year teaching, but I've always been in the classroom. This is my first year special ed.
Oh, okay.
And I'll be with 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and it'll be math and reading.
Okay.
I'm Larry Shell, and I'm in a self-contained autism unit.
Mhm.
And I figure this may just help, because most of my kids are out and about all day.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I am Candace Thomas, and I am a special ed teacher. I think I was in 9th grade, but this year we had kind of adapted a co-teaching model. So I actually had 9th through 12th grade in English.
Okay.
So I can definitely benefit from this.
Okay, good.
But so far, this is going into our 3rd week of school. So far, it's been good.
Mm-hmm. Good.
So
That's
I
good.
have learned some things to take back with me.
Yeah. Good.
Kyle Nebraska, Ashley County Schools, and I do the 6th and 7th grade special ed. I usually go into their English and their math, so we're at the same school, so we're trying to focus in on this year and do a little better job of it.
Okay, good.
I'm Eddie Davis. I'm at Jenkins Independent, and I teach music and band and humanities, K1, 2, and 6 through 12.
Oh, wow.
This is my 2nd year.
That's a
We
big
don't
one.
have any co-teaching.
You don't have any co-teaching?
No, last year I could have used some. In my 6th grade music, there were 32 kids.
Mm-hmm.
It was very hectic.
Mm-hmm.
They're splitting it up this year, so I'm gonna have the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade one. I won't explain it all. You don't need to know.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you for sharing.
I'm Leah Walters. This is my 6th year teaching, but 1st year teaching special ed.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll service 1st and 2nd grade students this year.
Okay. So this session really is about regular ed and special education and how we can work collaboratively together in a co-teaching situation. So if you may or may not have a co-teacher in your classroom, and that's okay, because it's really about thinking about how we can divide up instruction. So if you have a tutor or somebody else that's in that room. Mainly, when you have really optimally, co-teaching happens in a regular ed setting when you got a special ed teacher that comes in that room and helps to deliver instruction. But the instructional practices can be used with math tutor, it can be used with some other folks that you have in your room. So you can just go away with maybe just some strategies for that. So we're just gonna talk about what it is, and then we're gonna do some planning. We'll do a lesson plan around how you would work that out for a co-teaching setting. So the traditional way we think about co-teaching is when I was talking about two people in that classroom. Because, a lot of times if we have, for students with disabilities, the best setting for them to be in is in a general ed setting with some modifications and supports. So if you're a regular ed teacher, you maybe have kids in there that need modifications and accommodations. And so that's important to know what supports that they get. And so ultimately, the best way, the most effective practices are when two teachers collaborate together and the kids get what they need. Ultimately, that's what we want to happen, is that kids get what they need and the support they need. So we had a movement there for a long time that we had sent most of the special ed kids to the resource room. And then we had a movement where we sent most of the kids into a co-teaching classroom. And really there should be a good balance between what special ed kids need. So every special ed student is different, and they have different abilities and different needs. So one way or the other is not always, you can't go one way or the other. You've got to have the option for students to have co-teaching and regular ed, or pull out to the resource room. Because it doesn't fit for every kid. And so that's what we know about that. But what we also know about inclusion, so that's including those students with disabilities, 64% of the students that have an IEP, so 2/3 of the kids that have an IEP, spend 80% of the day or better in the general ed setting. So they're spending most of their day, kids with IEP have most of their day in the regular ed setting. And so if we have co-teaching that's effective, then we're more likely to have those kids that have an IEP in a classroom where they're getting regular ed, when you're getting the standards. And I'll tell you an example. This is my 26th year, and when I was in high school, I want to tell you how long ago that was, we had like some trailers that were there on the campus of where my school was at. And sometimes the special ed classes were in those trailers in the back. Do you have that too, Stephanie?
That was me. Yep.
Yeah.
I love the trailers. Phone didn't work out there.
Yeah.
Never saw a janitor.
Uh-huh.
Never saw the principal.
Yeah.
It was great. Right.
So think about those kids. Those kids have an IEP. But what if they spend their whole day in a whole separate room getting what? Not grade level standards, right? Because they're never going to be exposed to grade level standards when they're spending their whole day in a resource room. So they're not around the same age kids, and so their instructional level is way lower, right, than their age. So then they don't get exposed to a lot of good content. And this allows kids, when you do co-teaching, to be in the regular ed setting, but still get the accommodations and modifications they need, but then they get access to grade level standards. Because we're always trying to work to getting kids on grade level. Well, if they're never going to get there if they never know what it looks like or never see those opportunities. And so that's why there was a big push to get co-teaching in the classrooms. And so there's a lot of research around that and why we do that and what's effective with that. So now we've seen a shift with that. Sometimes you'll have districts that go all collaboration or all resource, and none of those are the solution. It's based on the individual student's needs. But, and so if the ARC, or the Admissions and Release Committee, and if you're regular ed or special ed, you're maybe on that committee, and you decide, let's say you got a student that has a specific learning disability in reading, for example, and you decide as a committee that student needs to be in, let's say they're in 5th grade, that they need to be in the 5th grade room for reading. And you have to decide, is co-teaching the most appropriate? And if that's the case, then you want to put them in there in that co-teaching classroom, but you also have that special ed teacher in there to give them modifications and supports. And then when that special ed teacher's not in there, then the regular ed teacher still has to give those accommodations and modifications and support. So it's so important that we all work together, whether you're regular ed or special ed, to make sure kids get what they need and that we're delivering what we're supposed to do. So if we decide that kid that has an IEP has to have those modifications and accommodations, we are all responsible for making sure they get those, even if you're regular ed. And so if those are not delivered, and if we say that they're supposed to be in a co-teaching classroom, we have to have them in a co-teaching classroom. That has to be in a room where there's a regular ed teacher and a special ed teacher. So if that's what's in their IEP, that's what we have to do. But the benefit of co-teaching is that you always have 2 teachers in that classroom, and all the students have 2 teachers. So there was a lot of times when a special ed teacher was used more like an instructional assistant, right, to run copies and do bulletin boards. And so that was, again, that movement, well, no, they're highly qualified. You know, if you, a special ed teacher is highly qualified. And so one time I heard it explained that a regular ed teacher is the content specialist. You would be the specialist in the content. A special ed teacher is a learning process specialist, right? So there's two very distinct jobs there, but when you have them working together, then all kids benefit the most from that. And you know, whether it's a instructional aide that's in the classroom during that time, if it's a gear up tutor that's in there in your classroom, or a special ed teacher, knowing as the lead in that classroom how to use all those people that come in during that time helps all kids. So as we go through this and you think, well, I don't necessarily have a co-teacher in my classroom, think about other adults that are in your room, or think about strategies during this time that you might could use. And so when you have co-teaching happening, you get smaller groups, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through this session. But the other thing is, if you've got two people in a room, if you've got 20 kids and there's two teachers, it becomes one teacher can work with 10 kids and another teacher works with the other 10 kids, right? You can divide that group in half. The more the learning can occur, the better the small group, you know, you get a lot more done with 10 kids than you can 20, right? Thinking about that. So that's the whole idea too, is if you've got two teachers in there, you can reduce that teacher-student ratio, and you can make sure that you've got more frequent, more direct, smaller groups. So those are two big benefits.
And along with that, you get more corrective feedback, which is what's.
Right, and right. Just like we were talking about that explicit instruction lesson this morning that we all went to, the I do, we do, you do part. If you've got two teachers in there during the we do or the I do modeling, and then they're giving kids feedback and they're helping them solve problems, and the kids that gives them much more opportunity. The other thing, you know, it's real important that we give our kids with disabilities lots and lots of practice turning feedback. But that's the same for all kids. If you've got gap kids in your classroom, if you're regular ed and you've got kids in there that are struggling, then those kids are going to need lots of practice turns and feedback. So it's not just the kids with an IEP, although we know the research says kids with an IEP need many, many more turns. Like if you've got a kid that has like a MMD, which is a moderate to severe disability, MMD is mild mental disability, and MSD is moderate to severe disability. That's your MMD and your FMD kids, right? That's one's got IQ issues. If we need to see something at about 7 times to be able to put it to memory, they need to see it about 32 times, right, to be able to get that. So you think about that. They need the most practice in turns. And so this allows that to happen because you got smaller groups. You can work with those groups of kids smaller. And then your groups can be flexible. So you have to think about how we group kids and what does our classroom arrangement look like. So whether you're a regular ed teacher, you're trying to figure out how you make that happen in your classroom, or if you're a special ed teacher, or if you've got a gear or a tutor in your classroom, thinking about what does your classroom look like, who are the people you have, and how can you use those resources. And so this one is another thing around how do we build those teams of collaboration. We always have to have those teachers collaborating. And it's good that schools build in time, like you all probably have time for common planning. Hopefully maybe some of you all have common planning times, or you have some times when you can get together and work on curriculum work, or you work on at school during your staff meetings, but time where you can get together and talk about what you're going to teach and lessons. And then also, you know, procedures in classroom roles and expectations. But anyway, all those are just good conversations between teachers about how we're going to do what the teaching and learning in this classroom, really is what that boils down to. So there are 6 big co-teaching approaches, and so this is all based on the research of Dr. Marilyn Friend. And so her research is the prominent. So everything that we do, we try to back by the research around what we know is effective and not effective. And so one of those handouts I gave you is kind of just about the basics of that. And I'm going to go through what those co-teaching approaches look like and just tell you a little bit about them. And then we're going to do a lesson activity. So the first one, it's funny that this one's the very first one. And this one's called One Teach, One Assist. So that's when you got one teacher leading the instruction, and the other one is just going around the room. So this is the most widely used practice in co-teaching and is one of the least effective. Because we started out saying we're gonna co-teach, and I can remember when this happened. So at that time I was teaching special ed, and I remember when they said, in my district, we're gonna co-teach. So you gotta go in the classroom and you're gonna be a co-teacher. So we go in there, and what do? We're walking around and trying to help kids as they need it, but are not contributing to the instruction at all. That's the way it happened when I first started. And I worked down the hallway with this guy, and I called it the coffee drinking strategy. Because he had this real nice coffee cup with a handle. And he always kept his coffee cup full, and he'd just walk around, always. He'd just walk around with his coffee cup and would point and kind of give kids direction. Well, that was a waste of talent and skills of a teacher to be walking around with a coffee cup in his hand, right? Because what was he contributing? And he had a doctorate in mathematics. I mean, he could have really been helping in the math classroom, or any of the classrooms. But, so he was a coffee drinker. So anyway, every time I train this, I talk about the coffee drinking strategy, because that was the one. The least effective, most useless strategy we had was the coffee drinking strategy. So anyway, so you'll see a lot about that one, and you'll see that one used all the time. There is a time and a place when that might be appropriate, but it's less than 5% of your day should ever be used for one teacher helping and the other one just walking around. The only time that might be good is if you're doing a formative assessment and you need somebody to check how the kids are doing. Something like that might be the only time that one would be useful. The next one now is parallel teaching. So you can put a little check mark by that, and if you'll see on that page I gave you, that second page, you can see what they look like. There's a little diagram there, and you'll see that parallel teaching, and what happens on parallel teaching is that you have two teachers in there, and you divide the group into half. So half of you takes one group of kids, and the other half of you takes the other half. Now, you can do that two different ways. You can have them grouped by what kind of level of support they need, or you can have them grouped by the way accommodations they might need, but you can also just divide them in half. And one of you take one group, one of you take the other group. Has anybody got some comments on that one? Okay. So you all seen this one used? Has anybody seen this one used in a classroom?
Could it get confusing to the students if we're hearing two people talk at one time?
That's a very good question. That is an excellent question, because so you have to be strategic in the way you do that. There's a couple different things you'd have to think about. Is your room size? Like in this room here, we would have to really think about how we could divide kids in half so that they're not interrupting each other. And we'd have to think about, we'd have to teach kids about noise level and how we had kids respond even, depending on the size of your room. But now we had this, in one of our schools, we had co-teaching that happened in a high school math. There was algebra 1 class. And so they had a room about this size. And like back in the back of the room is where they had a Mondo board. And so half the kids were there and they were looking at that Mondo board. And like the other half of the kids were over here in this corner working on another whiteboard. So the kids were divided in half. And so they were turned, their seats were turned that way, and then those seats were turned this way. And so they just had to monitor noise level and activity. But it can be done, so you just have to think about that. And you have to think about if you're really loud or if you talk really loud. Again, you might have to teach kids about the noise, about how loud you can be or how you can respond.
And if you're doing that in a math classroom, what you may want to think about is the kids that may be working with one teacher are doing less things with manipulatives, where the other kids may need a manipulative graphic organizer or something else. And so that teacher is actually walking them through the same content. They're going through the exact same content, but they're also working through that graphic organizer, they're working through that, using that type of manipulative. And those other kids are already very familiar with it and ready to move on to just using the algorithm.
Yeah. And that's a good point. Because when you look at parallel teaching, it says that the teacher might use two different methods for teaching the content. So, like Stephanie said, one of you may have kids that are using manipulatives and the other one don't need those, right? So you may have two different groups of kids. So that may be how you have that co-teaching situation. Or you could use that if you have a tutor in your room, right? Or if you have any other instructional assistants that are in there during that time. So there's other ways you can divide it up. But yeah, that's the big thing. Both teachers are teaching the same standard. So you're teaching the same thing at the same time. You may just use a few different approaches. one classroom I was in, they would use, one of them used a whiteboard and then one of them had a graphic organizer and they were doing story, elements of a story. So both of the teachers were teaching about story elements, but one of them was using a graphic organizer and the other one was using a timeline, kind of a different way to organize events in a story. And so that one, like I said, it helps when you can divide the room up and you don't have all 20 kids in one group, but then you get a much smaller group and then you can give them much more corrective feedback and much more guidance on how they're doing. So that's a really good strategy. This is one of the ones that's recommended most often. There are 3 that are recommended most often and 3 that are not recommended to happen very often at all.
The other good thing about parallel teaching is you end up getting that, what we call, it's kind of like the residue that kind of falls off from another teacher. Because I'm in the back, let's say I'm in the back row like she's talking about, and I'm not getting it as well from, say you're teaching on the other side, right? And so if you're teaching on the other side and I'm that student in the back and Dionne's over here, but I hear the way she says it and that resonates with me better than the way you're saying it. So I'm kind of getting that extra support I need because it's being kind of said twice because we're teaching the same content in a different way.
But I think you have to think about your setting. Some people can't teach like that and have a hard time teaching. And then some teachers, we still have a few schools, and even in our region, that have those open concepts for classrooms. So they've adapted to those open concepts. Some teachers, you might not be able to do that. And that would be something, if you were working together with a partner, that would be something you'd want to work out and make sure you all had that. Everybody kind of knew what their role was on that. So the next one is team teaching. And so team teaching is another one that's recommended because you're taking both teachers, like what Stephanie and I are doing right now, like I'm talking about something and Stephanie's jumping in and making an illustrated point. That's team teaching. She may come up here and chart or make a visual model, and we're working together. So it's not that Stephanie's sitting in the back drinking coffee and I'm up doing all the work. It would be that we're both contributing to that instruction. So that's what team teaching really is. Any questions about that one? Sometimes, if I'm in a math class, especially a teacher, I may not have that content knowledge for mathematics. If I have to go to a calculus class, a high school calculus class, and be a co-teacher, I'm not gonna be very fluent at it until I learn. So what I can do is rather than if on this one, you'd have to have a real good, strong content knowledge about calculus. However, I could be I may be building models on the board, or I may be creating visual representations or doing something else, but I maybe am not leading that instruction because I don't have that content knowledge. Does that make sense?
And this is a good way to have the other teacher who's charting or whatever for those kids who can't take notes or have trouble taking notes, the other one who's actually charting on a sheet and taking those notes while that other teacher's actually teaching. And so it's breaking it down for those kids that need it.
One thing that I used to do in the classroom, and now you have lots more technology, but I was in the classroom and we had those InterWrite boards, and you could write on your InterWrite tablet and then it would project it on the board, and so you could write those examples. Do you also have those? I don't know if those are, I bet it's been a few years.
We used to have those.
Yeah, you all, technology's advanced, because I've been out of the classroom for a little while now. But anyway, back when I had those, I would just, you could hit Control Print and they would print out. So I would just give those printouts to the kids that were the special ed kids in the class that needed those extra notes, or they needed structure notes, or they needed a graphic organizer. I created those as we went along, and then I could just print them off. So you guys have so much more technology now that you can snap a picture and airdrop it, right, or whatever. There's lots of ways that we can get supports for kids with disabilities now that used to we didn't have that level of technology we have now. But you can screenshot pictures, or if you've got something on the on your big screen, you can screenshot those, right? Send those to the special ed kids, and then have them in a folder in your classroom, in a Google Classroom, and you have resources and access to all of the content. But so that's how you can contribute, though. That's how other people in your classroom, if you have other people that are there, they can help you with the note taking. Because if you think about note taking, that's a strategy that kids need to learn. So sometimes kids will have a goal around organizing or content materials, And if they do, then that would meet that goal. So you as the regular ed teacher or the special ed teacher, you are providing the accommodations and modifications that kids need. So it's just a different way to think about it, but it's just making sure that we use all the people that we have in the rooms effectively, and they can help one another. Any questions about that one? That one's good, like if I know how to solve a problem one way, and Stephanie knows a different way to solve a math problem, you could get two examples. Because kids sometimes, like she was talking about, my way might work for some kids, but it doesn't work for all kids. And then Stephanie's way may be very different and help kids. But the thing I found most successful when team teaching was creating like a graphic organizer as we were going along, putting it on chart paper, and then I kept it hung on the room. So kids had a scaffold, right? And then you just eventually took those scaffolds away, but they had the support that they needed. Like I said, it's easy now to do screenshots and download notes and save notes and put them in a Google file or whatever. So kids, especially kids, have a lot more access to things now with the technology.
Or just in your Google Classroom.
Yeah, in your Google Classroom. Absolutely. So station teaching is one of the most effective strategies, and station is really how you set them up. There's generally a regular ed teacher station, a special ed teacher station, and then an independent station. So that's generally the structure of how station teaching works. So you can use station teaching in any content area, and you can use that even if you don't have a co-teacher in there. But
You've got a paraprofessional in your
Yeah.
classroom too. This is a great way to use them. I use my paraprofessionals all the time to do station teaching because it gave us that option to pull more kids, smaller groups of kids, and really hone in on what was their skills that they needed.
And so you may have a kid that has a instructional assistant that comes in the classroom with you, right? Do you all have that? You all have like a student that has an aide with them? So you can use those people to help facilitate some of your stations. They don't have to lead the instruction, but they can facilitate a station. So you can use people that way too. You know, if it's not true station, it's not true co-teaching necessarily, but it's how we maximize those adults that we have in our room. Because you could have them in a station, letting them work with number lines, or letting them work on, use calculators to solve problems, or they could be using a graphic organizer and kids could be filling it out, right? So they're kind of just supervising and giving some feedback to kids. They could be at a station where their kids are reading out loud and they can give them some feedback on that. They can help check student progress. You could be doing some of those progress probes. They can help with those kinds of things too in the classroom setting. So, but station is ultimately a regular ed teacher, a special ed teacher, and then an independent station.
How do you decide who's in the independent station?
Well, what ultimately happens is every student rotates through all the stations. So if it's something, what you choose on an independent station, when you put kids if you want to start them in an independent station, so let's say you got those 3 stations in your classroom, and the independent station would be something that you've already taught, that kids could do on their own. You could use your computers. Everybody has, y'all probably have everybody have a one-to-one device now, I think. So you could have kids working on something at one station, and then you could be the teacher in another station that's working on a specific skill. And then if you have another teacher that can be leading that station, if you don't, you could have, like I said, you can use an instructional assistant, or you guys will have math tutors, for example. They could be in a station. But that's one of the most effective ways for that collaboration to happen, because you're reducing, so let's say you have 20 kids in a class, and they would give you 3 groups, 2 7 and a 6 in a group. But it's a whole lot more to do with 7 in a group than it is with 21 in a group, right, or 20 in a group. So it reduces that teacher-student ratio.
Now, we did when I was working, we did a four group station, and we did a technology station where they would either use a computer or iPad, and then we had an independent station too. So it kind of broke that up. If you've got 20 kids in the classroom, you're down to, 5 kids at the most.
Right.
But it's another way to look at it if you can, but make sure it's something those kids, when they're at the computer, they can do by themselves, and if they're at the independent station, that they can do it by themselves.
And you can group kids. You think about how you would want to group kids, but you may have a group of kids that you need enrichment, right? Those kids that you need to push just a little further, well, you can have them in a group and they can rotate through as well. So they can have different tasks you could still be working on the same concepts, but they could have a little bit different tasks. And then you may have some kids that need reteaching, or while the special ed teacher is teaching something at one station, then you could be teaching another skill that's a piece of that in another station. Does that make sense? So it's a very effective way to use that, and it's very effective for what students need, so they get that small. There's another one right here, it says the 2 Kentucky academic standards can be taught using 2 teacher stations. So let's think about, when you're doing a unit of study and you've got multiple standards that you're teaching in that study, one of you could be working on one piece and one of you can be working on another part of that. Let's see, someone give me an example. What are y'all teaching, something that you're teaching right now? Just throw out something that you guys are teaching right now.
Percent,
Okay, you're working on percent. So what grade do you have?
7.
7th grade. So what all do kids need to be able to do to calculate percents?
There's 3 different ways, you got a percent, you got the decimal, then the fraction, they're all equal the same thing, but I know, sometimes I gotta be able to go between the 3 different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times, I'll bring in like real world things like, that they'll understand like maybe let's think about it like a pizza or something
Yeah.
like that.
Right, yeah. So you could be doing that at one station.
Yeah.
What would another teacher be doing?
Maybe like I said, maybe you could separate between the fraction table,
Mm-hmm.
the percent table, and the decimal table, that
Yep.
way it's kind of broken up.
That'd work great. So that would be a good way to do that. So, the independent station might be working on the decimals, right?
Yeah.
But you give them a task, maybe with one of the software programs
Like
that
the
you use.
IXL or
Like
something.
IXL, yeah, and they would have a task. The only thing with the independent station, you would have taught something, like
Right,
they could do a review even, right, or whatever, or, you've already taught, whichever part you taught first, then you use that for your independent station, and then you're teaching those new skills. So you can divide it up that way. And you don't have to do station teaching every single day for every single class, but think about once you've taught that initial lesson, how you wanted to break that out and get those, good opportunities for practice turns and feedback for them in those small group stations. And you rotate them. It's generally recommended about 20 minutes, and then you set a timer, and then you rotate, and so that they visit every station. Because, if you're teaching it like that, and if you're the regular ed teacher and I'm teaching it with fractions, and you're one that's teaching it with percents, and you want them to go to decimals, you ultimately want kids to go all 3, right? Just the level of support that you give them when they're at your teacher's station might be different. So you might group kids based on that too, the level of support that they need for that particular concept. Any other ideas? So you guys that have a tutor, how would you might use a tutor? You all both teach math, I know. So, any ideas?
I know in the spring, more or less, the way they had them broke up was, I don't know if the right word is the at-risk kids or what it would be, but the tutor who's in my room, he was given a list of those at-risk kids. So we would go through the normal lesson as I would teach it, and he would kind of chime in, here and there during the lesson, and then when it came to the work that they had to do for the day, whether it be the worksheet or whatever they were doing, then he would pull those kids back with him and give them kind of a small group addition to what I had already taught, is the way we did it in my room.
And that's you can do that certainly with that. So he's pulling a group that he works with.
He had
You pull a
probably
group.
5 or 6 in his room, and then I just kind of circulated the room.
Mm-hmm. So you could use that a couple different ways. You could use that as as if both of you are leading a station, that you could do that as parallel teaching. If you had half the group and then he had another group. There's another approach called alternative teaching. That's another way that could be working. Or you could have those independent station, and then you could have your teacher station, and kids could be moving through that.
Back in the day, we, like when I first started teaching, it was ungraded primary.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would have, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade students all in the same class, all on different levels. And that's basically what we did all day, station teaching.
Primary teachers.
It was, you just had to be very organized. And you had to, like you said, on the stations where you were not there or an adult was there, it had to be something they could do on their own.
Yeah.
And it had to be, or there was, I always did like a thing where they could do the assignment and then check it themselves.
Yes.
so that they could, see, you know, how successful they were. And then it was always timed, and we did reading groups, you know, which, when we would do like your different groups and your different levels, and you'd spend 20 minutes with one group or whatever, and then they'd move on to the next
Right.
station.
Yeah.
And it was like a machine. It was, you know, you had to keep it going. And it made the days go very fast, but there was a lot of planning involved in it.
Yeah, and that's a good point. It takes a lot of planning, because you gotta figure out who's gonna do what, and you gotta really know your procedures and structures. But once you get those in place, then you can just use stations all year long. And again, when you have, sometimes I would always like to use stations when I had another teacher in there with me, when I taught regular ed reading. I always would choose stations on the days that I had a special ed teacher in there with me, because then those were the days I knew I had somebody there that could lead those stations.
Back then, we also, you know, almost every primary class had a paraeducator in there.
Yeah.
So, you know, that was, their job was just as important as yours, because they, you know, they had the same, responsibilities that you had as the classroom teacher or the special ed teacher. But,
Yeah. And that is a great way. So let's say you got an instructional assistant that comes in there, using them to maximize what's happening in your classroom. So I know that you guys have specialists. I don't know if y'all have any instructional assistants that are in there during that time. I don't know if y'all ever get the luxury of that. Yeah. Sometimes that's not always a luxury, but that's good. But using everybody, because if they don't, even if they can't lead that station, because they might not have the content background, they can facilitate what you need to happen in that station. And that's a good way to use everybody. We had, one school had a speech therapist that would come in a couple days a week and work with a group of kids. So during that time, they used the speech therapist that had a group, and then they had special ed teacher had a group, and then the regular ed teacher had a group. So you see that divided that room again. But they planned for it for 2 days a week. During that reading block, they had all 3 of them were seeing kids at a station. So that's just one way to think about it, and make sure that we're getting, you know, that extra practice and that real direct feedback for kids. The other one is alternative teaching, and that's a little bit what Logan was talking about a minute ago. Alternative teaching, you have one teacher that takes the whole group, and then another teacher that takes a smaller group. And so you can use that small group for either accelerated teaching, or like if you need to give them, like you gifted kids, sometimes they need some extra support, so you could do that for acceleration. You can use it for remediation or reteaching. And so just because it's the special ed teacher in there, they don't have to take the special ed kids and just pull them to the table. Because when I was in school, I'd go down the hallway, and you had this lady that taught social studies, and she taught 4th and 5th grade social studies, and I'd go by her room, and all the special ed kids had to sit in the back, in the corner, with the aide. And they didn't get to sit with the other kids ever. So that's not alternative teaching. That's putting special ed kids in the back corner and not getting them what they need. And so there's a big difference, right? There's a big difference with that. And we don't want those things to happen. And the thing about it is, right now, we are all charged with kids having learning loss. You know, we need to accelerate learning. There's a lot going on. We just come back off a pandemic. This might be I don't even know if it's going to be a normal year, since we had flooding and all other kind of things. But, you know, we have a big task at hand. So we want to, you know, try to use everybody all the time. But that's the reason they come up with the co-teaching approaches, is because we don't want the special ed kids. Like I said, when I was in school, they put them in the trailer out back. When I was teaching down the hallway, that social studies teacher had them sitting in the corner, and that's not a good place for any kids. But those kids that we have that are gap kids that don't qualify for special ed, that are not making the progress as the regular ed kids, those kids need help too. And this is a way that you can do that. It's a way you can use them. But the alternative teaching is one teacher takes a big group and one teacher takes a little smaller group. And then this is probably the least effective. One teach, one observe. So one of them's teaching and the other one's just observing. Again, that's back to that coffee drinking strategy right there. You're not helping anybody if you're walking around just looking. We don't need a spectator.
Yeah, the only time you need to do that is if you're having to do like a latency recording or those kind of things, or when a student's getting that. Those kind of times, that's really good for that, but it should be very few and far between.
That's when you're monitoring behavior or something like that, right? All right. So let's move ahead. Now let's go ahead. I'm gonna let you work. You can work with a partner. You can work with somebody sitting beside of you. But I'm gonna just hand out a lesson plan, and let's just plan a co-teaching lesson plan. So I went real quickly through the lesson plan, the kinds of co-teaching strategies. Or you can work with a partner if you want to. And one of you choose a content area, and let's do a lesson plan. And this lesson plan, I'm bringing around, I'll let you all do all the thinking on this one. Choose with your partner, so an area you wanna work, yeah, we got even numbers, so. Choose which one of those strategies you would wanna work on. Choose a content area, reading, math, science, or social studies. Choose one of those strategies, and I would say choose either station teaching, parallel teaching, or alternative teaching. Choose one of those three, and tell me how you, what you put a lesson together, and what that would look like for a regular ed teacher and a special ed teacher. So I'm just gonna give you all about 10 minutes to work on that. Walk this door.
Well, I taught kindergarten for 3 years, so I had hated everything with them, so we did a lot of station teaching, so I would teach a station and she would have to teach at a station and she taught me kind of, it was like parallel too, I would,
Like half,
yeah.
and split the time up
Mhm.
into.
Yeah, and then we would also have a technology, station, and then we would have an independent workstation, so we had like 4 going at the same time,
Oh,
and it
nice.
worked really good.
Yes.
First year taught me.
Trying to think back, it was 4 years ago. So she just, I'll just say. Aaliyah. A-L-E-A-H.
Eddie Davis. D-A-V-A.
We have to say the first 2 sounds like the F and the L sound together, so they'll learn those sounds like individually at first, and then we'll teach them how to blend those sounds together. So what I would do on my station, we would go over all the things that we were covering, and then we would just read passages that would go with it, and then the other teacher, because we did this in like 10 to 15 minute intervals, and then she would go up there and just kind of like read what we had covered in my station, and she would go through like flashcards and say like one flashcard had an FL on it, so they would have to
So this
recognize.
is one, the other one do an alternative.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, honestly, it's like taking a mixture of those two together. Introduction and what we did, so yeah, just kind of follow up on it, yeah.
Okay.
So then like I said, you just say she's a special teacher. she would have like all these different, the cards have like FL and they would have to say that's like the full sound. Yeah. Uh-huh. And this is like one of the very like early lessons that we do, so it's like the beginning of the school year. Assessments, so what we would do would be, we would start this on Monday, and then on Fridays, we would always do is use the assessments over if the students could recognize all the words that we covered. So just say, yeah, basic assessment covered. And all we would have to do is give them a list of words and they would just have
At the
to,
end of the,
successfully blend those words together.
So it would be like an oral assessment.
Yeah. We could say on Friday if we saw that one of our students was struggling, we know we could go back and maybe do some archaeology next week or I guess those specifically answered. Guess that would depend on how the lesson is. Yeah. Hopefully we'll be successful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we were,
Our school can't afford that.
our school is a staff.
Y'all about finished up? Okay, let's do, we've got about 6 minutes left, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups in here. Let's let each one of you spend about a minute telling about what your lesson you come up with and what your co-teaching strategy is and what you would use. So, does anybody want to start? All right, so we get about a minute.
Okay, we decided to do 8th grade math, and our lesson topic is finding unknown values, either X or Y. Our learning target was I can solve polynomials. We're going to use the parallel teaching model. The gen ed teacher could do solve by using substitution. It's a little more complicated than graphing. I figured the gen ed teacher would have the more content knowledge, so, and the special ed teacher could do solve by graphing. It's the more basic one. The assessment was just to give multiple examples of each to ensure proficiency, and if there is something wrong, have the gen ed teacher overlook it and just correct any errors.
Okay, so you have special ed teacher using graphing, and that's a particularly, if you don't have a special ed teacher, not a strong math with math content. Good. Anybody questions for them? All right, next group, what'd you all come up with?
So we did 5th grade science, and our lesson topic was the water cycle. And learn part was like analyze the different steps of the water cycle, and we chose alternative teaching. And the general education teacher would introduce and kind of walk through the different parts and just tell what each different part does. And the special ed would have a group over to the side, and they would be more in-depth with models and visual aids and stuff of that nature.
And that wouldn't have to be all just special ed kids either, right? Because those some of your kids that were having trouble, or even the regular ed kids that needed to see those models of graph, or those models, that's good. That's a great way to use that. All right, how about you guys?
We done 6th grade math, addition and addition numbers. We chose the station teaching strategy. Our general education teacher would be, actually start off with the lesson, she'd be modeling the direct explicit instruction and providing corrective feedback to students' practice, just the examples that they're working on. They would then move to the special ed teacher where they could practice and develop that skill further with any kind of manipulatives or any kind of adaptations to be added there. And then third, we would have the independent work, which would be where they just do their formative assessment, their work for that day, that they could rather be graded on.
Great. So you had a real specific role for regular ed, specific role for special ed teacher, and then the independent. So you had all those pieces. Good. Great. How about you guys?
We did a station teaching, and she's actually doing Beowulf right now with her seniors. So we went ahead and sort of applied it to something she's doing. So we decided to break it up into those stations. Gen ed teacher concentrating, on the different characters, plots and themes and symbols within the story to look for. Then the special ed teacher would have a vocabulary station where they go over some of those tougher words, defining them, maybe usage in a sentence and trying to connect them to something they could understand. And then there would be an independent group that was going through doing the reading and checking for comprehension questions, and maybe trying to write a little summary in their words. That comprehension could be the kind of assessment as well, or exit slip it, see what they got out of it, and if there's needed reteaching or something needed or independent work.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, because so you have that role, what the regular ed teacher's gonna do, what the special ed teacher's gonna do with the vocabulary. That's a great way to divide it up. Because special ed teacher may have some really strong vocabulary strategies too, because they're the learning process specialists, so they can bring those strategies. Absolutely, great job. How about you all?
We chose kindergarten, and their co-teaching model is kind of like a mixture of station teaching and parallel teaching. So we're going to have 4 different stations, and it's all about phonemic awareness and being able to recognize those different patterns and blending. So we said that the general education teacher could do the initial introduction of the phonemic awareness and the blending of all the different sounds, and how to be able to recognize those patterns in a passage, and that the special education teacher or the IA in the room would be able to follow up with different strategies or manipulatives at another station to be able to just further their practice with the blending. And we also use Lexia, the computer program, that way we could implement technology, and then an independent workstation where they could still be able to recognize some more of those patterns.
Sure, that'd work good too, because you could take, you might have blending boards, so one teacher could run a station with blending boards, and you change the how do you add, the B and the L and blend those together. So you could use manipulatives with that, word blocks and letter sound blocks and those kinds of things, while another teacher's teaching a strategy with that, visual. There's lots of technology resources you have, so all of those are great ideas, so all of those were correct. So the idea was that you just intentionally plan. You say, okay, this is what target we're working on, this is how we plan, this is what your job is, this is what my job is, this is what we're gonna have kids do, this is how we're gonna assess their learning. So as simple as that, and between 5 and 10 minutes, you all were really able to think about how that lesson might roll out, and everybody would know what their job was. And that's what we're talking about with co-teaching, it's just planning intentionally to provide instruction for kids. But imagine every kid in that classroom benefits, and that's the whole idea of it. One, that every kid benefits, and 2, that we make sure we get that specially designed instruction for those kids having IEP. And we all have kids with IEPs, whether you're a special ed teacher, if you're a regular ed teacher, you're gonna have about 80% of the day, you're gonna have the special ed kids in your classroom, so you gotta know how to accommodate and work with those kids too. Same thing for explicit instruction, using those strategies. Can we make sure we get good instruction and provide those for all of our kids? So that's it, I think it's time for break, I believe. It's time for this session to end. Break, we gonna give